what's up? Welcome to Comic Book Nation's latest bonus round episode. If you're seeing this, we are Comic Book Nation hosts Kofi Outlaw and Matthew Aguilar. And in addition to our latest show, which we just did live, talking Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, we had to do this bonus round episode talking about the other big thing that happened in entertainment this week, the end of HBO's Succession. So, Succession came to an end a week ago, and it's been an interesting week to kind of just to digest, to take it all in. And in my case, and in the case of a lot of other people, go back and start to rewatch the series and kind of see how the finale episode really encompassed, you know, what we've been building to over 4 seasons of this show. So right off the bat, I think we'll just kind of give our impressions of the finale, and then we can get into the larger discussion about how it wrapped up Succession. I loved this episode. If you didn't know, Succession's finale was, of course, in a feature film length episode. It was about 90 minutes, and it featured the Roy family having to determine the fate of Waystar Royco after the death of patriarch Logan Roy. Spoilers, that happened early in season 4. And as I wrote in an article for comicbook.com, you know, basically saying what will Succession's finale be about before we got to the episode, I speculated that the episode would take a 2-pronged approach. Fans picked up in the penultimate episode, the funeral episode, that there was going to be this retreat to the Caribbean for the family that their mother had called, and that there was this big board meeting to determine if they were going to sell to Alexander Skarsgård's Gojo, you know, online media imprint. And yes, we got, because this show has been about, you know, the divide between business and family, and how for the ultra rich, it's almost like this sociopathic blurring of those lines.
Lack of family.
Oh, yeah. Those lines get blurred all the time, back and forth, or just manipulated back and forth. And so we got to examine that from both angles, the personal family angle, and then what happens in the boardroom. What I did not know going in was what order would we get that in? Would it be the boardroom, and then the fallout plays out amongst the family in their private like vacation thing and in the personal side? Or would it be the vacation first, where we set up this arrangement of either conflicts or bonds, which then play out in some crazy way in the boardroom?
Yeah.
And it turned out to be, of course, the latter. Yeah. Which was,
was the right decision.
Yeah. Which was, I think so, the right decision too.
Yeah.
Because of what this show does. And like I said, we'll get to that. So I loved this finale. I thought they perfectly captured exactly the two sides of this world. And it captured and made the point brilliantly that, yes, these lines are, like I said, almost sociopathically blurred, crossed, manipulated constantly. And that these characters, in a weird way, do not change.
Right.
And that there has been, and this is a point I think we'll debate, that a lot of people are debating now and maybe not getting, is that this show is, and people are saying this wildly, they're like, I feel like I watched a comedy. But like, yes, if you didn't know, Succession was always a dark comedy. It's Adam McKay and Will Ferrell's name on it. So this was always that Adam McKay kind of socio-political dark comedy in Office style, where the characters don't get the comedy. It's us, the dramatic irony of what's being said, and us being able to process this isn't like normal. And so I think it did it brilliantly, and it pulled it off. And there was a major kind of climax to this, which is in that boardroom, all of that personal stuff finally boils over. Yeah. In one of the most kind of, you don't think like we'd come away with like a boardroom meeting scene, but like one of the most intense, affecting, disturbing scenes that I've ever seen in a drama series, in that boardroom, like when everything finally explodes. Yeah. And it's as ugly as, you know, we've been quipping and making little jabs and jokes and smiling through for 4 seasons. But when the money was really on the table, things really did get ugly. Yeah. And I thought it was wonderful. So I loved it, Matt.
Yeah, well, I think I really enjoyed it too. I think it's incredibly difficult to end a series before you go too far and the cracks start to show. And 2, to give an ending that is satisfying and also authentic. And I think what this show really did was stayed true to who these characters have been the entire time. If it ends differently, because what it does is give you just a glimpse at what it could be. They've done that throughout the whole show. But in this episode specifically, they give you a peek at what these three could be in some fantasyland world where family and being siblings matters more. And they give you just a glimpse of that, and then they go, but that's not who they are. And so then you pull back and you go, oh no, this is who they really are. It was never gonna last. Any alliance was always gonna fall apart. And ultimately money and success is what really drives them as people as well as family. And so this episode really just brought a focus on it. It's a very tragic ending in a lot of ways, aside from like even Roman. I would say Roman gets away with like it's not as tragic for him, but like for Shiv and for Kendall especially, it is a pretty tragic ending for them. But that's how it should have. That's how these characters have been this entire time. So for me, like for them to kind of switch it up and go, no, we're going to give one of these guys a happy ending, would have felt weird. It would have felt like it's not true to who they've been this entire time and the things they've shown that they are willing to do when that's just family's not rooted. And that's all a lot of that's Logan's fault, but you know, it's just he's not around anymore. So I thought it was excellent. You know, there's a couple scenes in here that just really hit home. I mean, the whole boardroom sequence especially, but like the three of them together.
Yeah, let's get into spoilers. Let's get into some specific spoilers here. So, interesting enough, you're talking about on the vacation, so early on the episode, how it's structured is that Roman, Shiv, and Kendall go to their mother's place because they're tracking down Roman, who's had this like breakdown at his father's funeral. He went kind of nihilistically off the deep end, you know, fighting with protesters at the end of the penultimate episode. And now we find him retreating to the Caribbean. He's been hiding out and he's kind of like out of the game, right? Like he's not interested anymore. And there's an interesting thing because somebody did an analysis of like what they're wearing. And he's the only one wearing like now he's wearing like a Walmart t-shirt or something, a Target t-shirt in that scene. And while they're all wearing like designer stuff. Anyway. So they go and the kids bond, and they bond around this whole thing that Kendall comes to kind of secure their vote again, as he's had to do, because I just got done a season 1 episode where they did the no confidence vote in Logan, and at the end, Roman, you know, kind of craps out on him and is too scared to do it, and then he loses everything. So Kendall comes again to try this thing again, and you know, he gets his sibling seemingly behind him until they screw him over in the boardroom. Yeah. And Shiv screws him over this time. Yeah, she refuses. It comes down to her vote for him to keep the company and be in charge finally and get everything he wanted. And she won't do it. She screws him over. And Kendall flips out and physically attacks her when she's pregnant, physically nearly claws Roman's face off when Roman brings up because that his kids aren't necessarily in the line of succession because Shiv's pregnant and she's the only one of them that's actually producing like a real heir, you know, because Kendall's trying to argue line of succession stuff and Roman stumbles into like, oh yeah, well, if you're talking that, she's the only one. Your kids aren't really, you know, family. And Kendall flips out and nearly claws his brother's face off over that. It gets real ugly. Funny enough, behind the scenes, the party or the scene of them in the kitchen, where they finally anoint Kendall as the person they're going to get behind, and they make this disgusting shake out of everything in the kitchen, and Shiv spits in it. First of all, Jeremy Strong, the actor who plays Kendall and is, you know, notoriously method, he drank that thing. No. She really spit in it, and he really drank it. So he really drank that shake. I wouldn't have, but, you know, they did. But that was the last thing they filmed.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. That was the last thing they filmed, and they did it so that they could, like, end it on a healthy note for them.
For them. Yeah.
After people. All the stuff in the boardroom that went down. So they actually.
That's so interesting.
Well, that's how people found out about the Caribbean thing is they went there very late and it was like super secret and they just shot it and it was like very intimate and they shot that scene at night in the kitchen with a shake as the last thing. And so them like playing and having fun and the joy of that scene is them really kind of like knowing this is the last
closing
thing they're
out
doing
the chapter
and closing out like the show. Yeah. And then they went and shaved Jeremy Strong's head right after that.
That's crazy. Because that scene means so much there. You're like, oh, it just gives you that little faintest glimmer of like, oh, they're gonna get on the same page and they're supporting him, and it's like, it's just, and then also too, I mean, that leads to there's a lot of like really quiet poignant moments in the show overall. But like, especially here, I mean, when you finally learn then who is going to be in charge of the company, which I guess we can get into that.
Yeah.
With Tom kind of taking that role on, and the scene with him and Shiv in the car.
Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about the ending for each character. Let's go.
So like that whole
people got mad confused. There's a lot of debate about that kind of monologue, that montage of endings for each character.
So okay, so for like for Shiv specifically, or it's just all of them?
All of them, but Shiv was the biggest one.
Because
this sparked an interesting cultural debate. Yeah, but this sparked it's been very interesting to see Succession and how Succession plays to like people of color versus people of like non-color. And we won't get too deep in this. This is ComicBook Nation, not a social debate. But like, people of color saw this show and they saw these characters as like the ultra wealthy white characters. And that was brought up on the show. And they handled it in a very deft way, but in the almost sociopathic way that these people always do, where they're just like, oh, the Black Jews will be mad at us if we do that. Roman always would shout that. Yeah. Or they would just say like, oh, we are going to anger this social group, but screw it, we're going to do it anyway, was always their policy. But just to see how people are reacting to like whether like Shiv was a heroic figure, because some people were actually flipping out saying, oh, they ruined her character in that boardroom moment. It's like, have you guys been watching this show?
How?
Like
they have ruined.
Yeah, let's talk about who Shiv is and talk about each of these characters for a minute. Okay, so writing 101. First of all, start with the names, right? Shiv.
It's in her name.
It's in her name. And not just behind the scenes, but in universe. It's her nickname. Her name is Siobhan, but they all call her Shiv. Which, if you are not familiar with your prison lingo, a Shiv is the bladed weapon that prisoners hobble together out of whatever they have around. Random parts they tape together to a blade, filing a toothbrush down to a point. And it's used to, secretly stab somebody. Yeah. To walk up on somebody, and usually in the back or the side and the ribs is how you kill somebody with a Shiv. So it's a backstabber. It's literally in her name. Like that she is a backstabbing, vicious kind of thing. Like that's how she was as a political operator. Yeah. And that's who she is through and through. And it's made the point several times, I think in like season 2 or something, that her and Logan get the closest when he's kind of like considering that she might be the most him amongst them. And so that was always Shiv. Yeah. And so her doing that is the truest thing I think they've done to her character. And it's a complicated thing, but and again, I think there's an element of cultural thing in this, which is like, she's an ultra wealthy white woman. And so she occupies this weird space of power, but no power. And that's kind of her dynamic throughout the show, is her being the most powerful, rich Siobhan, Roy, but then always finding herself never really being able to access those wheels of power in front of the men in her family and life and surrounding her. And that was the whole thing with her and Tom. Tom's the one man that she can own and manipulate and kind of work that all out on until Tom decides to say 9, like no more, and kind of flips the script by the end. Yeah. And so Siobhan's whole thing with the hand is her, again, in that occupying space, that cultural space where, she's now arguably the most influential Roy at Waystar Royco, but it's also only through the avatar of Tom, right? And so that's a very complicated but profound, also not just character, but again, cultural statement, like that Siobhan is what in a lot of people of color were saying on Black Twitter was going off about this, was about like, oh, of course Siobhan, if she had the option, would take, instead of giving power fully to her brother, would take making power her secondary form of power would be her choice, because that's what we see in culture all the time. And like, it's like, all right, that makes sense to me. So I didn't have any debate, and I'm mad at the Shiv debate. I'm like, you people were not watching the same show. No, it made total
sense to me.
Yeah, you're not watching the same show if you thought like Shiv was the heroic figure who was like morally like...
Because none of them are. No. Like, it's like, that's the point.
You and me were talking, or me and Charlie were talking, Charlie Ridgely, who works, is a big TV guy for us here at Comic Book. There are episodes where Shiv is going on and on and on about like political morals, things like that. And then something in a deal changes and she literally pivots in the moment. Like they'll be like, okay, we're not going to support that guy because he's a fascist. And then another thing, hey, he says he's going to like do the deal and I think we're going to be able to get him through. Okay, so then like we're going to...
You rationalize.
Yeah, she starts rationalizing and keeps going. And you see this in a moment several times. I mean, from the beginning when she jumps her political opponent to go work with Nate and this other guy who's going to screw her father, then jumps from that and that and that. So that all made sense to me. Roman is even more direct because I was watching the pilot over again, and it's amazing how much of this finale connects right back to the pilot. In the pilot, Roman comes in, and he hasn't been in Waystar Royco. He was out in LA with Frank doing that, and this is his big return in the thing. And he's talking to Kendall, and Kendall's all like gung-ho coming in, like, hey, we're doing this? Like, we're doing this new deal he's trying to do. Yeah. And Roman's like, I hated this place. This was always a cage to me. He literally just kind of says that. And over the course of the show, it was because of his father and wanting to earn his father's respect that made him put on his big boy pants and try to act mature and be Mr. CEO until it all literally fell apart when his father was dead. And he never would process that and couldn't process that he didn't have to do this stuff anymore. And it was all kind of over until the funeral. Yeah. And so in this one, when he just kind of is like, we're nothing. And he gives it up and he's like, it's over. And he's ready to let it go. Like, again.
Makes total sense. He's never wanted, like, it was never about.
And I think Kendall even says that to him at one point. Like, did you even want this? Like, do you even really want this? And Roman doesn't. Yeah. And so he's back to drinking and just being party boy, and he's happy.
He's going to be happier.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's far happier.
And then Kendall, finally, which is my favorite kind of thing, is Kendall was always just an addict. Like, Kendall was always an addict. He just, in the beginning of the show, what you're seeing, and when you go back and you really realize this, is he's coming in after rehab, after all this stuff, and like so many addicts, he didn't cure his addiction. He just shifted it. Like, his addiction wasn't anymore. It wasn't about drugs and all that stuff. It was about power, the thrill, and he's that A-type kind of stock bro. The power of the deal, you know, all the lingo he uses. You want to get, we're effing, I want to F, you know, I just want to close it, which means not the vulgar expletive, but like, I want to close this deal and closing the deal and doing all this and gaining the power. That's what he was addicted to. Yeah. And that's the brilliant thing I think you see come out in the finale in the boardroom. Yeah. Is when Kendall finally has that kind of addict rage and he knows he's not going to get his fix, like, he just flips out like a crackhead on the people who are he sees as preventing him from getting it.
That's interesting because I can see that, because I absolutely see that. But when we get to the scene, you know, him looking out the water and all that stuff, it felt more like I've like finally coming to, not even coming to terms, finally staring like failure in the face. Like, I've tried this so many times and there's no going, like, you can't do it now. There's not the hint of, well, maybe dad will come around or maybe we'll do this or whatever. It's like done. You can't go back. And that's a hard thing for like anybody to be able to deal with and process, especially for someone who is so, but those addict traits definitely show in that. Like, it's hard enough to deal with that for someone who has drive and who's just like devoted their most of their adult life to this one goal, and it's not happening ever. On top of the complicated grief/hatred that you have for your father. I mean, that's, you know, it's you know, people in our family or family trees have had the same result of relief as well as anger. It's an anger, you're grieving, but it's also relief because a presence is gone. And so there's a lot of that. Like, I saw that when he's there, and he's like, I know he's a method actor, and like, you know, I know there have been like things like that, take shots at that, you know, and I understand why. But I mean, that scene's amazing. He does so much just with expression. I mean, it's just like everything is so quiet in that scene. But I can see that though. But I can see also the addictive things for someone who's dealing with that. On top of that, that would be even more difficult, because now your fix is gone, but also you're dealing with all this other baggage. Yeah. So,
and I think, and the reason I brought it up in the addiction is because I think there is a dark joke in this finale that comes out, which is that we're supposed to look at Logan Roy as kind of this asshole, abusive patriarch figure. But he also is the one who's like the least self-deluded about how he sees the world, how he sees people, and we get sketches of why that is across the show. His sister dying, his uncle abusing him, like his family is a mess and always has been, and he kind of like clawed himself up out of that mud. But he's right about everything he says about his children over the course of the show, like all the biting comments that like they thought traumatized them. Like at one point he says like to Roman, like, you're not a serious person, like you're just not a serious person. And that's Roman's whole thing. It's like, oh, I am a serious person, and blah, 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 blah. But at the end, like, no, he's not a serious person. Kendall, he says, like, you can't do it because you're kind of a junkie and you have that mentality of a junkie. Like, you're just not reliable like that. And again, that's kind of the traits that come out. And for Shiv, it's the same thing. It's like, well, you're not mature. You're always trying to like get back at your daddy and use things to do that and to kind of tantrum and act out.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happens in the end. So I think it's funny because Logan Roy, even as a ghost, is kind of like, the show proves them right. And I think each of them has to face that in that boardroom. That's the real conflict for me. It's not just with each other. It's not just over the business. It's with the ghost of their father because that's what happens. Like, he dies and none of them really grieve or process.
No.
They shift into this other thing of then trying to get this deal, keep on, prove themselves. As that's immediately in that funeral episode, they even have the meeting about it. It's like, oh, are we sad our dad died? No, how are we going to now present ourselves as the new kings, queens, or whatever we're going to present ourselves as? And so I think that all kind of runs out when the deal runs out, and it's just like, now they have to kind of sit with
which
the
is also
self-realization
of
like,
extremely toxic presence.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because you don't, people grieve in all different ways, but if he's not the complete, like, because he's very upfront about his own failings and he's very upfront about like his children's failings. He's not always upfront about his effect on his children's failings.
I just watched a therapy episode where that's the question in the therapy episode in season 1, like when they go to the retreat and the therapist says like, do you realize the effect that you have on your children? And his response is to say, F off. They just tried to do a vote of no confidence in me. Like, they're fine.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Know, it's you know, that's its own delusion of.
And by the end of that episode, he like verbally abuses Siobhan to the point where, and Tom, where they just like go up in the room and they're like all messed up. Kendall relapses. He's smoking meth with those guys, and like
it's
Roman's
like,
just like, what is going on?
So there's a lot going on.
So
but I thought they did a beautiful job. And it leaves you with, I mean, I feel like you leave that show and you're like, okay, it's done. And I thought it's an excellent self-contained story. But that finale, one, I love that they made it 90 minutes. Yeah. I like that. Because there was enough room for everything. It didn't feel too short, didn't feel too long.
It went fast.
Like, right, yeah, it's done. So, excellent.
Yeah. And what I love about it is, you know, HBO, good old HBO. They can Game of Thrones this thing. There's enough room here to, while we're saying goodbye to the Roys, and like you said, this is a complete story. There is still room to keep this going. Sure. Like, you know, even if you focus on like what some of the characters do next as their next venture, or you go back in time and you just look at Logan and his brother and their family, because there's a lot of messed up stuff in there. Like, I didn't get the end of that therapy episode when they're in the retreat, because there's a whole thing about the swimming pool and he won't go swimming with them because the therapist is like, let's go swimming. And Logan's like, yeah, no. And they're like, no, he never swims. And the very last scene of the episode is him swimming. And he gets out of the pool, and because when nobody's around, and Marcia puts the thing on his back, you see all these scratches. Yeah. And when he's in the kitchen with Kendall, and Kendall's relapsed, you know, Kendall comes in and he's talking trash, and he says, you know what your uncle like would have done if I had talked like this when I was a kid? And he was like, oh, what would he have done? And then the scratches are meant to signify like he was seriously abused as a kid, and he refuses to let like anybody know that. But going back and seeing that family drama of somebody building the media empire and stuff would be good. So they can do a lot with Succession.
For sure.
Yeah. Procession. No, I'm just kidding.
Please don't let that be
don't make that a title, please. I don't do this for a living. But I think it's safe to say we recommend go on Max, watch Succession. If you did not, this was another hit event kind of series for HBO with good reason. A lot of it might have gotten muddled for you in the pandemic and all that. But it is definitely worth checking out. One of the best kind of dark comedy dramas on TV ever, at least in America. I'm sure England would be like, hold our beer, but in America. So go check that out. Succession. And thank you for joining us for this bonus round of Comic Book Nation. Be sure to sign up and subscribe to our Comic Book Nation YouTube and on your favorite podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, and join in for our regular show every week. I'm Kofi Outlaw. This is my co-host Matthew Aguilar, and we'll see you guys out there on Comic Book Nation. Peace.
Deuces.